Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies and TV shows with history. Today, we're going back into the Old West to learn about one of America's first detective agencies in that TV show simply called The Pinkertons. Set in the 1860s, The Pinkertons is a historical crime series that follows Allan Pinkerton, his son William, and Kate Warren. In the series, Allan Pinkerton is played by Angus McFadden, William is played by Jacob Blair, and Martha McIsaac plays Kate. Each episode in the series covers different crimes in the early days of the Pinkerton Detective Agency in Kansas City, Missouri. Now, there are a total of 22 episodes in The Pinkertons, and we're going to dig into each one of them. But that's a lot to do in a single podcast episode. So we'll break it up into 3 different episodes, which means today we'll kick things off with the first 7 episodes of the TV show. To help us separate fact from fiction, we'll be joined today by someone who I have looked forward to having on the show for a long time, Rob Hilliard. Rob is the author of In Freedom's Shadow, and if you're watching the video version of this, you can see I'm holding up a copy of his book right here. And as you can see here on the back, Rob was kind enough to include my quote on the cover of the book. So, of course, if you're not watching the video version, you should pick up your own copy of Rob's book to see for yourself. You'll find a link to that in the show notes for this episode. But before we hop into our chat with Rob, it's time to set up our game for this episode, 2 Truths and a Lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 facts. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, the Pinkertons really did investigate the first train robbery in the United States. Number 2, Allan Pinkerton started his detective agency in Kansas City, Missouri. Number 3, Kate Warren was the first female detective in the United States. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie, and I've got the answer tucked away in the envelope that we will open at the end of the episode to reveal and see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Rob Hilliard about the first 7 episodes of The Pinkertons. Before we dig into the details of each episode in the series, let's start with some setup of the entire series overall. So if you were to give The Pinkertons a grade based on its overall historical accuracy, what would it get?
I'll answer that question by saying I really, really wanted to like this show. I'm sure you can kind of see where I'm headed. It was, and for entertainment value, I thought it was pretty good. My wife and I sat down and watched it. We run through a couple episodes in the evening, sort of semi-binge watching it. So, entertainment value, I think is probably in the CB range, but historical accuracy, it's like a D, maybe. And that might even be me being a little bit charitable just because, like I said, I really wanted to like it. I thought at the beginning, like, especially with the first episode, it seemed like they were going to take, the Pinkertons are well known, not maybe as well known as they once were. But I thought they were going to take a little bit of an unknown aspect of it, which was the Kate Warren, female, division, which of course we'll talk about a lot more later, but, and then William Pinkerton, when you hear people talking about the Pinkertons, you always hear them talking about Allan Pinkerton, who's the founder. They called him Will in the show. I guess I'll call him Will, but I never saw him referred to as anything other than William, and we'll do research, but regardless. But I thought, oh, this is kind of neat. They're going to take a different tack on this and, really tell a different story about the Pinkertons. And they did certainly take a different tack and tell a different story, but unfortunately from an accuracy standpoint, it was one that was, almost completely fabricated, and it was kind of episode after episode. And there were a couple, as we'll of course talk about here, there were a couple where there were grains of truth, and, but they were, they just fell apart.
Well, you mentioned some of the characters, and a common thing a lot of movies, TV shows do is to change the characters. And we're talking about a TV series today, and there are some main characters. There's some secondary characters that we'll see periodically throughout. We'll talk about some of those later. Let's get a quick fact check of whether or not the main characters were real people. And this is strictly my interpretation of who the main characters are. So feel free to add any others that you feel are relevant. But you mentioned Kate Warren, who I think is the lead role. I consider her the lead role in the series. There's Will Pinkerton, along with his father and the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, Alan. You see him a few times here and there. And then there's two associates we see helping the Pinkertons regularly throughout the series. There's John Bell and then Kenji Hara. And then the primary law enforcement that we see throughout the series is a character named Sheriff Logan. How many of those are based on real people?
Well, the first four, I think that you mentioned there are for sure. Then I'll kind of take them one by one here. So Kate Warren, very much real person. She's known, to the extent that she is known, really as the first female detective, or at least the first female detective in the United States. And she did work for the Pinkertons. Again, we'll talk about this a bit more later, but the Pinkerton Agency was founded around 1850. She started working for them about 1855 or 56, depending where you read it. So that part is all true. And she worked for the Pinkertons through the Civil War and then after the Civil War. But that's kind of where it stops is in terms of accuracy. So a couple things to know. She was, and I got to check my notes here, but Kate Warren was born October of 1829. So in 1866, when the show was set, she would have been 37 years old. And Martha McIsaac, the actress who played her, was born in October of 1984. So in 2014, when the series ran, she was like 30 years old. And so there's a bit of an age gap there, but not, Hollywood's Hollywood, right? So, as you said, a lot of times they play fast and loose certainly with ages. A couple other things to note, important things to note about Kate Warren is one, as I said, she, when the Pinkertons, which I know we're going to talk about a whole lot more later, but the Pinkertons served as the espionage arm of the U.S. Army, or the Union, early in the Civil War, and Kate Warren was one of the agents, operatives, as Alan Pinkerton liked to refer to them, who served in that capacity. So she was actually a spy for the Union during the Civil War. In that role, she really had involvement in two very critical pieces, or two critical things. One was what's known as the Baltimore Plot, which was the inauguration of Lincoln, really prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, in early 1861, where he was traveling from Springfield, Missouri to Washington, D.C. after he'd been elected. And the Pinkertons caught wind of an assassination plot that later became known as the Baltimore Plot. And the idea was that Lincoln was traveling by train. He was going to come through Pennsylvania to Philadelphia, then down through Philadelphia, or from Philadelphia down through Baltimore into Washington, D.C. along the railroad route. And there was a Confederate, the Confederate States were already starting to secede at this point. So the schism was already, beginning to happen. And there was an organization, I'm struggling with how to exactly couch it without giving you an hour-long explanation, but the group was called the Knights of the Golden Circle, and they were pro-Confederate, and there definitely was a scheme to attempt to assassinate Lincoln, or at least a lot of discussion around it. Now, what's unclear is whether it was really something that was going to be carried out, or it was just a lot of bluster and, impossible to know at the remove of, 160 plus years. What we do know, though, is that the Pinkertons caught wind of this, and they made a connection through the railroads with Lincoln, informed him of it, and they changed his travel route. And so basically, instead of coming from Philadelphia, they got a special train, went over to Harrisburg, which is about 2 hours west of Philadelphia. Well, 2 hours driving. It would have been more than that in 1860. And they came in the middle of the night from Harrisburg into Washington, D.C., and completely avoided the path that they were going to take through Baltimore. And so, to hear or read the Pinkerton version, they saved Lincoln, avoided his assassination. Kate Warren was actually his escort during that last leg from Harrisburg down into, really from Philadelphia to Harrisburg and down into D.C., or one of his escorts. And so she was intimately involved in that. Now, the reason I'm sort of, using some weasel words in describing this is, again, we don't really know. It's hard to prove a negative, right? Well, it didn't happen. Does that mean it was never going to happen, or it was and it was avoided? If you hear the Pinkerton side of it, of course, they saved Lincoln's life, and Kate Warren was integral in doing that. But there are equal arguments from other historians who say, this was all, just a lot of talk, and it was Pinkerton kind of self-aggrandizing, and he's certainly guilty of that in other areas. So it's a believable accusation, but anyway, so that was Kate Warren's involvement there. And then the other thing that happened to her during the war, as I said, she was working as a spy for the Union. And she was actually captured and served about 9 or 10 months in a Confederate prison in second half of 1862, and was released in December 1862. So she was, by the time of the setting of the show, really quite an experienced. She'd been working for the agency for 11 years at that point. Had been in prison for a while. So it was really quite an experienced and sort of veteran agent for the Pinkerton agency. So, and very much worthy of being a lead character in a show, which was, again, one of the reasons why I was excited about it at the outset. So anyway, moving through the other characters here. Will, I get, like I said, I guess I'll go with calling him Will. That's weird to me because I always think this William, but he was, very much a real person, very much Allan Pinkerton's son. He was Allan's oldest son, which I know we're going to talk later about his younger son, Robert. But that was something that seemed like the show, they weren't specific, but it seemed like it was a little backwards. Like they kind of made it seem like Robert was the older one. But anyway, but another thing that they really got, I won't say they got wrong, but they didn't portray correctly, was in 1866, Will Pinkerton was only 20 years old. He was basically a kid. And Jacob Blair, who's the actor that played him when the show went on the air, he was 30 years old. So he was the same age, as Martha McIsaac. And of course, in the show, as it goes on, they kind of play that for, that there's a bit of a romantic interest between the two. But the reality is that Will Pinkerton was younger than what they portrayed, and Kate Warren was substantially older than what they portrayed. So in reality, there was like a 17 or 18 year age gap between them.
And she had almost been an agent for as long as he had been around almost.
Yeah. Yes, that's exactly right. And in fact, she was, basically old enough. She could have been his mom. And so with the, as I said, like, as they kind of played that for a romantic thing throughout, it would have been quite a bit weirder if she was, if she was 17 years older than him. So I understand why they did it, but again, just focusing on the historical accuracy, that was way off base. Just a couple notes on Will. He was, by 1866, had been working for the Pinkerton agency. He even did a little bit of spy work during the Civil War when Allan Pinkerton was in Washington, D.C., even though Will was only like 16, 17 years old. He wasn't sort of actively in the field from an agent standpoint, from an espionage standpoint. but he did travel with his father. In fact, I saw one note, and I didn't find anything to verify this, but that Will was actually wounded in the knee by a piece of shrapnel at Antietam. So he was in the field, you know, from that standpoint. He helped run espionage agents during the war. Like I said, I didn't see any indication that he was actually undercover anywhere outside of Washington, D.C. Now, there was plenty of spy activity in Washington, D.C. at the time. So that's not to say that he wasn't, you know, eavesdropping or acting as a spy during that period, but I don't think he was ever behind the lines in the Confederacy like some of the other Pinkerton operatives were. So one other note on him, on Will, was he did really, one thing that did show accurately is he really preferred being in the field and being a field agent over kind of the office piece of it. So that was portrayed accurately. Although a few years later after the time period of the show, I think it was around 1870 or 75, him and his brother did take over the operation of the firm, and they ran it up through the late 1800s, maybe even the early 1900s. I can't remember the exact date now. And so they kind of ran it as co-heads through the latter part of the 19th century. And after their father passed away. So he did, even though he did act as a field agent at times, it wasn't, again, not the way it was shown in the show where he's carrying a brace of pistols and, you know, drawing down on everybody he came across. And that looked cool, but, you know, not a real thing. So, so that's probably a good segue to Allan Pinkerton. And again, very much a real person. He was emigrated from Scotland. He was born in Scotland in 1819. Emigrated to America in 1842. And he was portrayed in the show by Angus McFadden. They were actually pretty close on McFadden's age. I think there was a difference there of about 4 years. Pinkerton was like 47 in 1866, and McFadden was 51 at the time of the show. I don't have anything at all to base this on. It's just a guess. But I suspect that McFadden is listed as one of the producers of this show. And I suspect that this was kind of a passion project for him because he's Scottish. Pinkerton is famously Scottish. And like I said, I suspect that, you know, McFadden kind of put this together from a creative standpoint. So
I got that impression as well as I was watching it. Yeah.
Although weirdly, then he hardly showed up in any episodes.
Yeah, that is true. I guess I also kind of, I don't have anything to base this on either, but I got the impression that he was more behind the scenes, like, but also more famous than any of the other actors. So he probably had other jobs to do.
Yeah, well, you're probably right about that. This is kind of an aside, but one of the things I did read about the show and researching for this show was to save money, it was filmed in Western Canada, and I can't remember now where, British Columbia or someplace. But I think that's one of the reasons, to the point that you just mentioned, that you never see any like recognizable guest stars, and they were kind of drawing on the local acting community, which, I mean, the population of Western Canada is small, so I'm assuming the acting community is really small, at least prior to when Hallmark movies were being shot there. And so anyway, I guess that was one of the reasons why you never, like, usually when you see a show with different guest stars each week, somebody different being murdered or being the murderer, you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that guy in such and such a show, right? Or that woman. And that, I don't know that happened even once watching the Pinkertons.
I don't remember any of them.
Yeah. But anyway, quick background on Allan Pinkerton. As I said, he emigrated to America in 1842, moved to Chicago. Interesting part of the story, his story was he came here he was a barrel maker, a cooper. And so the way he got into detective work was he was actually out looking for lumber and he was on an island on the Fox River, which is, I guess, near Chicago, and stumbled onto a group of counterfeiters and ended up working with the local sheriff there, county sheriff, to break that counterfeit ring. And in doing that, I think he kind of found that he had an aptitude for it. And he also found that I think there was a reward involved. And so, found out that it could be lucrative. And so that's really what led him to found, originally it was called the Northwestern Detective Agency. And he was partners with an attorney named Edward Rucker. And then a few years later, he bought Rucker out and it became Pinkerton's National Detective Agency, which is, of course, how you see it in the show. And, but that was the foundation of, and I know that was one of your questions here that we'll talk about, but of the Pinkerton Agency was really through that. I mentioned already that they were credited with breaking up the Baltimore plot, so they became pretty well known through that. And I talked about them, hiring on as the espionage arm of the Union Army early in the Civil War. So, a couple other characters, John Bell. I think you and I chatted about this before. The presumption for both of us is that he's supposed to represent John Scoble, who was, of course, the subject to my book. Well, I know we'll talk about that. And so I'm not going to dive too much into him because we have some questions later to talk about, about him, who he is and what he did. I can't begin to fathom why they changed his name other than if they just thought that Bell was easier to pronounce than Scoble. Hard to say. But he was, I'll just say for the purposes of answering your question here, most accounts indicate that John Scoble, I will call him by the name that I'm familiar with, was a real person. There are some people who will dispute that, and again, we'll get into that. But he was an agent for the Pinkertons during the Civil War. That's the only documentation that we have of him. It's not impossible that he worked for the agency after the war, but there's no record of it. And the reality is that John Scoble, or John Bell certainly wasn't his real name, but that John Scoble probably wasn't his real name. And so I guess I can just touch on that real quickly. The information that we have about John Scoble was from a book that Allan Pinkerton wrote in 1883 called The Spy of the Rebellion, and it talked about his agency's involvement, all the things I've already mentioned, how they were working for the government. Every bit of information about John Scoble traces back to that book where Pinkerton talks about him. And there have been lots of people research him over the years, but and Pinkerton used different names. For example, Kate Warren was given a different name in that book, and some of his other agents whose names did not become known at the time of the war, he used a nom de guerre, if you will, a fake name for them in his book, essentially, or presumably to protect their identity because it maybe wasn't known that they were a spy during the war. He most likely did the same thing for John Scoble. So you have a guy who was born a slave, so there's no record of him. He escaped, made it to the North, became a spy, where, of course, his identity had to be protected. And then 20 years later, his only biographer, Allan Pinkerton, probably used a fake name. So there's really no way to trace his existence. And so that's why I say, there's no record of him having worked for the agency after the Civil War. There's no record of him at all after the Civil War, aside from Pinkerton's book. But the problem is, unlike the white agents who worked for Pinkerton, there are records of them that you can kind of trace backwards to say, oh, this was really this person, but, they used a different name. But with Scoble, with his circumstances, there's no way to trace that backwards. And a lot of people who, like African Americans today, who are trying to do genealogy research run into the same kind of roadblocks working backwards. So anyway, that's the short version of background on the character John Bell. Kenji Hara, who was portrayed as an agent, an Asian agent who came on board for the Pinkertons at this time period. The only reference to anybody named Kenji Hara that I could find anywhere was I believe it's a Japanese artist from the 20th century who was named Kenji Hara. So I don't know if they just plucked that name or what. Not a real person. We'll talk about this a bit more later, I think, as well. But I haven't come across any record of the Pinkertons having used Asian immigrants as agents. Not to say that they didn't, but I've not seen a reference to that anywhere. And then Sheriff Logan was what I like to call the token Barney Fife character. He was, kind of the bumbling sheriff who couldn't get anything right. He was not a real person. I did look up, though, the actual sheriff of Jackson County, Missouri, which is where Kansas City is located, in 1866, and it was a guy named Henry Williams. So we're able to document who that was. It wasn't Logan, and again, nothing like like he was portrayed in the show. You can actually look up Henry Williams, though, and you can even find a picture of him online. So.
Yeah, I got the sense that he was the token law enforcement. You got to have somebody there for the agency to refer back to, and actually have a jail to put the people in the catch for each episode. Yeah.
Right, and somebody to outwit every time, right?
With that kind of overall, we start digging into some of the individual episodes, and the first episode in the series called Kansas City at the very beginning, because it's set in Kansas City, Missouri, as you mentioned, in 1865, 66, somewhere around there. And according to the show, that's when the first train robbery in American history happens. And so Alan Pinkerton calls his son Will, along with the world's first female detective, Kate Warren, and they're called in to solve the train robbery. So you already answered a little bit of that, but that's the impression from the TV series. That's the origin story for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. And I'm guessing that's just not true at all.
No, not even remotely. Although the funny part of this is the first train robbery in U.S. history did happen in 1866, October 6th. And it was by a gang called the Reno Gang. And they, just give you the quick rundown on that. They got on the train when it pulled out of the station. Don't ask me the name of the station. I don't remember that. But, and they rode along for a certain distance, and then they got up and they were carrying guns, and they went to the mail car, and there were two safes there. And they were able to break open one of the safes and take the money out of that. And there was some cash and also bonds, if I recall correctly. And then the other safe they couldn't get into, so they actually just opened the door on the railroad car and rolled it out of the moving train. They just pushed it out the door and said, well, we'll come back for it later. And so that is all true. And the Pinkertons actually pursued and captured and broke, I'll say, the Reno Gang. But nothing remotely first of all, it happened in Indiana, not Missouri. It was Will Pinkerton at the lead of that pursuit. But it didn't happen until about 2 years later in 1868 that they finally captured one of the Reno Gang, I think in 1866. The others they didn't really kind of fully break the gang until 1868. And there are, a number of more robberies, and there was one where the Pinkertons were, they found out about it through their detecting skills ahead of time and hid on the train. So when the gang hit the train, there were like 10 Pinkertons armed and waiting for them when they broke in. So they captured a couple there. So it is true that the first train robbery in the U.S. was in 1866. It is by the Reno Gang, and it is true that the Pinkertons arrested them. That's it, though. Out of a 60-minute episode, Um, none of the rest of the facts even remotely match up to, to what was portrayed in the show. So, and it wasn't, to more directly answer your question, of course, it wasn't the origin story for the Pinkertons. Again, it was kind of shown that way, but they had already been in operation for 16 years. They were already already had a national reputation as a detective agency / police force. And so it wasn't the beginnings of the company or, anything like that. So
now, people listening to this, I'm sure, will understand, the Pinkertons. They'll have heard that name before, probably, and they actually, as far as I understand, they're still around today. Would it be fair to say that this entire series is trying to be like an origin story for a detective agency that still exists?
I think the answer to your question is yes. That's how it came across in the series. But again, the fact that they aren't, don't match up with reality. But it is still, so the company that was known as Pinkerton's National Detective Agency kept that name until it was like the mid 1960s, I should call it that. And they changed to just Pinkerton's Inc. or Pinkerton, I think it's Pinkerton's Inc. But yes, they're still very much a real company, very much involved in security today. If you go on their website or their Facebook page or anything, you'll see they deal a lot in cybersecurity. I think they still provide some like private protection services and things of that nature. But yeah, they didn't originate in Kansas City, Missouri. They didn't originate in 1866. All that stuff is made up.
Well, talking about with John Bell in this series, we see him for the first time in episode 2. And when we do, I thought this was interesting. When we see him, he already knows who the Pinkertons are. And since we just found out about the Pinkertons in the TV series like an episode ago, either word travels fast or there's a lot that the TV series isn't showing us. How realistic would it be that he would have known about the Pinkertons the first time? Of course, in the series, that's the first time he meets Kate Warren. And it sounds like he may have already worked with her. How realistic is this kind of first meeting?
Yeah, so there's two parts to the question there. The first part is how well known were the Pinkertons and could he have known them? That is actually very realistic because by the close of the Civil War, let's say, the Pinkertons were not a household term in the way that they would be 20 years later by, say, the 1880s. At that point in time, if you said Pinkerton, immediately everybody knew who, not only the company you were talking about, but they were associated with Allan Pinkerton. He kind of became like semi-retired in the mid 1870s and started writing books about what a great job what a great detective he was and all the wonderful things he did.
So modest.
Yeah. I like to say he was a great detective. He was kind of a middling spy. He was a terrible writer. And he was about as, he was about as modest as a WWE wrestler. Let's put it that way. So anyway, but the reason I say that is that was kind of the era of the dime novel and all those things. So, his books sold, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of copies. And so by that late, like the period that we know is like the Old West or, the Wild West era, call it like 1875 to maybe 1890. The Pinkertons were, probably almost literally a household word. Anybody in the United States would know that name. At the end of the Civil War, they weren't quite that famous, but they were still very well known. There were articles about them in the newspaper and newspapers all across the country. They actually ran advertisements for themselves in the newspaper, advertising their security services. So it wouldn't have been, unusual at all for somebody to know them. Now, second part of your question was they did kind of imply that John Bell knew Kate, although it wasn't on the nose. Like it was a little weird how they said it. And when they said that, I was like, oh boy, here we go. We're going to get into, the John Scoble story. And then they just immediately veered off and, never came back to it. So, but again, in real life, John Bell would have very well known Kate Warren because they worked together. I don't believe they were ever partnered together. At least we don't have documentation of that, but they both worked as Pinkerton operatives working in the Confederacy out of Washington, D.C. during a period between 1861 and 1862. So that's a very small group of people. And as you can imagine, pretty close knit. So yeah, they would have absolutely, it would have been more like when he walks up there and she comes out of the door and points a gun at him. It would have been more like her coming out and probably giving him a big hug in real life. Because it'd been, 4 or 5 years since they'd seen each other. So.
Well, you talked a little bit about a river near Chicago. And at the end of the second episode, we see Allan Pinkerton. He's leaving Kansas City to go back to the Pinkertons' headquarters in Chicago. But then the show stays in Kansas City. That's why we get Kate and Will as kind of the primary main characters throughout the rest of it. Is they're basically, the impression I got was that they're running the KC field office, basically. And we already talked some about the Pinkertons' origin story, but because there aren't any other locations mentioned at this point, as I'm watching the show, I'm just assuming that the Pinkertons probably started in Kansas City, then Allan went to Chicago to try to expand into further territories. Is that a good representation of what really happened?
Yeah, again, no. You hear me say this a couple of times as we go through. It's backwards of, the impression they gave in the show is actually reverse of what happened in real life. So, Allan Pinkerton, when he came to the U.S., settled in Chicago. That's where he started the detective agency in 1850. So that's where they were built up. Their headquarters remained in Chicago and from 1850 until 1960, when they finally moved to New York City. So they were very much rooted in Chicago. In fact, to the extent that one of the kind of interesting sidebars when I was trying to research about the Pinkerton agents and so forth during the Civil War, a lot of their records were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire, which was 1881. I want to say, I'm probably wrong on that date, but of course all the records were paper and they literally went up in flames with the Chicago Fire. So yeah, they were a Chicago company, born and bred, and stayed there for over 100 years. As near as I could tell, and I tried to dig into this, so you could find out a little bit of information about when they opened other offices. So they opened one in Philadelphia and another one in New York around the time of the Civil War. And those were opened by George Bangs, whose name you might recognize because it was mentioned a couple times during the series, although he doesn't ever appear on camera. And he was really Pinkerton's right-hand man. In fact, there are some pictures taken during the Civil War where you see Bangs is in the picture with Allan Pinkerton. But Bangs ran the agency in Chicago for the most part during the Civil War. He opened those 2 new offices. I couldn't find any indication that there was ever an office in Kansas City. And there almost certainly wasn't in 1866 because they had just opened those other 2 offices. And Kansas City was, a cow town in 1865 and only had a couple thousand. Actually, I think you provided me with this information, but like 3,500 residents. There would have been no reason for the Pinkertons to have an office there. So yeah, like I said, it was basically the opposite of that, where the Pinkertons were starting to expand, but they were expanding from Chicago east, where the population was, and by extension, where the money was and where the crime was. And they did ultimately work into what is today the Midwest and then later in the West. But not during the time period that's established for the show. Maybe
it's kind of what you were referring to before, where they're filming out in Canada, out in country area. And it probably costs more money to build a set like Chicago than it does to build like a cow town like Kansas City in the 1800s.
Yeah, you are absolutely correct. And this is also, I was going to talk about this later, but I guess I'll just hit it now. It's what I call the Gunsmoke model of TV production, right? So you build one set in one town, and then you bring all the bad guys to you, right? You don't have to travel around because it's very expensive. And even if you build a set of Chicago in the 1800s, like you said, that would be expensive. But the reality of the Pinkertons is they traveled really all over the country, and it would have been more like, I'm like really showing my age here, but the old, not the movie, but the old TV show, The Fugitive, where he would travel from city to city each week. So if you were following, let's say, Will Pinkerton, it would look more like that, where one week he's in Kansas City, and then another week he's in, I don't know, Duluth, and then another week he's in San Francisco. But if you're going to create sets for all those towns that look like they did in the 1800s, of course, you're going to be in for a lot of expense. So I think that was their, like you said, you build one set in the middle of nowhere, and you say, oh, okay, well, they were working in the middle of nowhere, and that becomes that becomes the base of the storylines.
You talk about people coming into their town. And if we go back to the series, in the third episode, we see a traveling troupe that comes into Kansas City to perform Shakespeare's Hamlet. And one of the actors is a guy named Robert. And Will joins the troupe undercover to investigate the episode's crime. We find out that Robert's real name is Edwin Booth. He's the brother of John Wilkes Booth. And he's been hiding his identity to basically separate from his brother's assassination of President Lincoln. And I'll go ahead and fill in one historical fact. We do know that John Wilkes Booth really did have a brother named Edwin Booth. But my question for you for this episode is kind of a two-parter. Was Edwin Booth an actor who tried to hide his identity after his brother's assassination of Lincoln? And did Pinkerton agents like Kate Warren and Will Pinkerton actually get involved in a case with Edwin like we see in the series?
So the answers to those questions are no, and definitely no.
Sensing a trend here. Maybe that's why you gave it the D.
Which I'll refer back to the original D grade. So as you said, Edwin Booth was the brother of John Wilkes Booth. They were actually both actors, and they were the son of an actor named Junius Booth. And they had another brother named Junius Jr. Prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, and well, really even through the Civil War, Edwin Booth was probably the most well-known actor of the time in the whole U.S. He traveled through Europe and all the great stages of Europe, Paris, London, wherever. Every big city in the United States, and even some smaller ones. So he was super well known, and I have an anecdote here that kind of shows that. But before I get to that, just to directly answer the question, so there was, of course, negative blowback after John Wilkes Booth murdered Lincoln. But Edwin Booth, first of all, was known as such a staunch Unionist. And in fact, he and his brother had actually had a falling out around 1863 or 1864, not really publicly, but it became known later, over John Wilkes Booth being such a staunch Confederate and anti-Lincoln. And so Edwin Booth really distanced himself, a year or two prior to Lincoln's assassination. There was a period of time, very short after the assassination, where Edwin Booth didn't act and he laid low. And I think that was probably less to do with him or his reputation than it was respect for Lincoln, and just out of respect for the assassination and just not feeling right about having his name out on a marquee. But that faded away pretty quickly, and he was back acting again by January of 1866. So we're 9 months after Lincoln's assassination. And Edwin Booth owned a theater in Philadelphia, and I think he owned another one in New York City. And so in January of 1866, he was back on the stage in New York City at his theater and performing Hamlet. Probably that was, I guess, his favorite show. But So yeah, he didn't hide from the public eye, in any way, like it was shown there. And it was, again, I think less reputational than just sort of, I don't know if I want to say a mourning period or whatever, but just more, out of respect for what happened and his family's involvement in it. But I'll give you another tidbit, and this is what I'm going to say about Edwin Booth being so well known. It was either late 1863 or early 1864. Robert Lincoln, the son of Abraham Lincoln, was about 21 at the time, and they were at a train station. I think it was in Washington, D.C., but I could be wrong on the location. But anyway, there was a crowd of people that were pushing onto the train, and Robert fell off of the ledge and fell between the wall of the platform and the train and couldn't get out. And if anybody's ever, been to a train station or even a subway, there's like a little narrow crease there, and he fell down into that, and somebody reached down and grabbed him by the coat collar and yanked him back up literally as the train was starting to pull out. So probably, certainly saved him from being severely injured, maybe saved him from being killed. And so when he pulled him back up onto the platform, and Robert Lincoln actually wrote this, story, told this story. He said, "I turned around to thank the person for saving me, and I recognized it was Edwin Booth, the famous actor." So a couple interesting things there. Obviously, direct connection between the Booth family and the Lincoln family more than a year before the assassination. But also that's how famous Edwin Booth was. It would be like, I don't know, Kevin Costner helping you out today, and you'd be, turn around, look at him like, holy mackerel, you're Kevin Costner, That's really how well known Booth was, even, during the time of the Civil War.
And were the Pinkertons ever involved with Edwin Booth at all? I mean, we see him in the series. No connection there.
No, I couldn't find any, even any like passing reference, any connection between them. So, yeah, he was very much, near as we could tell, law-abiding citizen. There was an incident, I would think it was maybe in the 1870s or 1880s, where somebody took a shot at him while he was on stage. Apparently that was more of a jealous husband situation than anything to do with the Pinkertons or the government or the Civil War or any of that. But yeah, aside from that minor thing, he was, well, I shouldn't say it's minor. Somebody took a shot at him, but
well, yeah.
It's minor to me, but
not something the Pinkertons would investigate necessarily.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think there was ever any connection there.
You might have already answered this when we were talking about John Scoble before, but in episode number 4 of the series, it's called The Fourth Man, and it's referring to John Bell, who, according to the series, becomes the fourth man in the Pinkertons alongside Kate, Will, and Alan. What was the real John Scoble's relationship to the Pinkerton Detective Agency?
Well, yeah, we touched on it a little bit before, but I'll give you some additional background about, John Bell / John Scoble. I'll tiptoe around a few things because my book In Freedom's Shadow is about John Scoble, and there are some spoilers there that I would rather not give away. But we've already kind of hit it, so a minor spoiler is that Scoble did in fact work for the Pinkertons during the Civil War. So the beginning of that story is John Scoble was a slave in Mississippi prior to the Civil War. After the war broke out in kind of the middle part of 1861, as many Confederate officers did, his master, of course, volunteered for the Army, and then they went north into the Robert E. Lee's, wasn't Robert E. Lee's at that point, but it was the Army of Northern Virginia. And once there, Scoble was able to escape. And when he did, he made his way to Washington, D.C. And at that time, Alan Pinkerton was, as I've referenced several times here, the head of what he called the U.S. Secret Service, but it's not the Secret Service that we know today. That was just the term they used at the time for spy agencies. And Pinkerton, to his credit, one thing I should note is Allan Pinkerton was a very staunch abolitionist. And the reason I mentioned that here is there were such cultural beliefs at the time that were, anti-Black. And obviously that's the whole basis for slavery. And I'm not going to get into a giant tangent on that because we could teach probably multiple college courses and not capture that in a podcast. But the point is there was an assumed ignorance, or not even ignorance, but low IQ of Blacks at the time. But because Pinkerton had, as I said, was a staunch abolitionist, had different views, he had the idea of starting to interview, really debrief the escaped slaves who were making their way from the Confederate side to the Union side. And that was kind of the first time that had been done because of the reasons I just mentioned, like people didn't think they would get any useful information. But the reality was those slaves that were escaping from the South to the North, they were, yesterday afternoon or a couple days ago or whatever, they were in the place where you were trying to get information about. So they might know what infantry units were here, what cavalry units were there, how many cannons did they see, at such and such a place before they came over. And so Pinkerton set up basically a network of getting these people as they came over, bringing them to his office on I Street in Washington, D.C., and debriefing them. And that was very similar to what you see today in a war zone where they're interviewing refugees and, again, debriefing them and trying to find out, well, what's going on the other side of the line where I can't see, but you were just there. So it was a very modern idea, really, on Pinkerton's part. And when he interviewed Scoble, he made such an impression, Scoble made such an impression on Allan Pinkerton with, when I was working on my book, I was talking to a guy who was a CIA agent, now retired, but who had done research on Scoble when he was with the agency. And he used a phrase that really stuck with me. He said, when Pinkerton met Scoble, Scoble had what we would call today street smarts. Like, well, for one thing, he could read and write, which was unusual for a slave. But the impression that he made was with his, again, I'll use the term street smarts, where he was just sharp. He picked up on things quickly. So he made such an impression that most of the escaped slaves who came through, Pinkerton interviewed them, got their information, and then, sent them on their way. And by the way, as another aside, on their way was usually to what was called a contraband camp, where escaped slaves were able to live free in the North, but in kind of they were free, but they weren't totally free. Again, I don't want to sidetrack the whole conversation here, but it was kind of an odd, almost a purgatory existence for them. Anyway, the important part to them was they weren't in slavery anymore. But Scoble made such an impression that Pinkerton actually recruited him to become an active spy and part of the Pinkerton agency. And then he was sent back undercover, of course, as a slave into the Confederacy on multiple different espionage missions. So that's the background on Scoble with the Pinkerton agency. As I said earlier, we don't really know what happened after the war. And whether he remained as an agent or didn't, there's just no documentation of it. So it's at least plausible that he might have been working for the Pinkerton agency come 1866. It's implausible, as we touched on earlier, that he would be in Kansas City because there probably were any Pinkertons there. But there wouldn't have been, kind of back to the episode, there wouldn't have been any reason to bring him in as the fourth man because he would have already been working for the company for like 5 years at that point. So,
well, you also talked about Kenji Hara and how he's not a real person. But in this episode, we see Kenji kind of becoming an apprentice for the Pinkertons. Did the did they have apprentices, kind of like what we see happening in the episode?
No. But I'll qualify that no. I will be quite as hard of a no as I was on some of the other ones. The Pinkertons did have an extensive training program. So when they came in, and I talked about this a little bit in my book, but Pinkerton talks about, when they brought in John Scoble, teaching him and all their operatives, teaching them to do certain specific things, like shadowing somebody, which was a term that the Pinkertons started using. We use it regularly today, right? To shadow or follow somebody. Alan Pinkerton also used the term pumping people for information, which today is kind of a common term, in an interrogation, but Pinkerton actually invented that, or at least put into common usage that term. So operatives would be taught to do those things. Now the qualifier is up into the 20th century, but certainly in the 18th century, the word apprentice has a very specific meaning. And the Pinkertons did not have apprentices. So you would have an apprentice who, like a printer, for example, or a blacksmith, or some type of a trade. They would bring in an apprentice, and it was maybe somewhat analogous to an intern today, which meant you could get them to do your menial labor and you wouldn't have to pay them as much as like a regular employee. So it wasn't slave labor, but it wasn't a whole lot more than that. But the idea being that they would work in that apprenticeship for some period of time and then learn that trade, and then eventually they could go off on their own. So I kind of, in that episode, when they talked about him being an apprentice, it kind of struck, my ear wrong, because I'm like, oh, that's not an apprentice. He's just like a trainee, which today, the way those terms are used, they might sound somewhat similar, but 160 years ago, it would have been a very different thing and a very different implication of the term. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, they would have a very specific meaning for that, so they wouldn't have used it for that term.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, apprentice was, they used to use the full term was apprenticed to trade, meaning you would go, you would work there for nothing or almost nothing, but again, you would learn that trade. So like the examples I used, printer, blacksmith, a farrier, something like that, they had apprentices. A detective agency wouldn't have apprentices. So.
Well, in episode 5 of the series, we find another character named Captain Buckner. And the title of the episode is called The Hero of Liberty Gap. And according to the show, Captain Buckner is using heroics during the Civil War to run for mayor of Kansas City. That is, until Kate and Will figure out that Buckner lied about what he did during the war. So this episode is them kind of uncovering the true story. I did a quick Google search, and it tells me there really was a Confederate officer in the Civil War named General Simon Buckner. But in the series, when we see a flashback of Captain Buckner hiding during the battle, he's wearing the Union blue. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just assuming that this storyline around Buckner's faked heroics during the war were in themselves fake for the series. So my question is kind of more around the fact that this is the first time in this series we see the Pinkertons getting involved in any political affairs. Did the Pinkertons actually get involved in politics like we see in this episode?
No, not the way we saw in this episode. So a couple of notes. I did exactly what you did. I'm like, are they talking about Simon Bolivar Buckner? And we're like, well, but then when, like you said, it kind of showed him being, and I think they even said at one point that he was a Union officer, or that he claimed that he was. And it is worth noting that it was a real thing. And, of course, today we might use a term like stolen valor or, something of that nature. But it was very much a real thing in the U.S. at that time for people to claim that they did something during the war that they didn't do. So that wouldn't have been unusual, and particularly, in that era where you didn't have good documentation of, people didn't have a driver's license or, social security number or whatever. So it's hard to know, like, was this, they might even have the same name, right? But is this the same, John Doe who did this, or was that some other guy with the same name? And so that wouldn't have been unusual. But on the political side, this sounds harsh, but I think it's pretty accurate. The Pinkertons didn't do anything that didn't pay. They were in it for the money. And I know there's some stuff, that we'll talk about some other episodes later where it was like, well, they're kind of looking out for the little guy, and that was not a thing. They were, Alan Pinkerton was scrupulously honest, but he was also harsh. He was almost dictatorial at times. And he was all about the business. And at the end of the day, he was about the business of making a dollar. And so when you say, did they get involved in politics? They weren't, like the way that episode, plays out. I think they even say something like, well, who's going to pay for this? Or who's our client here? And they wouldn't have been working on it if they didn't have a client, if somebody wasn't putting the bill. But now the other side of it is, and Alan Pinkerton was good about this, it became more so when William and Robert took over the firm later. They definitely did cultivate political relationships that they felt would benefit the company. So, and they also at times provided security, including for Abraham Lincoln, for political figures. But yeah, to get involved in like hands-on involved in an election the way it's shown here, that wouldn't, I'm not aware of any instance of it, and I would be extremely surprised because it doesn't pay, right?
Yeah, that was a good point there. I forgot that they had kind of talked about, who's our client, but so it kind of gives the impression that they're just out to do the right thing.
Yeah, which is great for characters in a TV show, or can be great. But yeah, it doesn't reflect real life. And I'll even say, this is really kind of I'll call it a writer's aside here for a minute, but in Freedom's Shadow, when I was writing about John Scoble, we don't know all the details of why he agreed to work for Pinkerton and to go back into the South. And because obviously he was putting everything at risk, right? His life, his security, his freedom, all those things. It's entirely possible that he did that as an altruistic thing, and to help others who had been in this situation and try to help the Union win and free the slaves and all those things. From my standpoint, though, when I wrote the book, I was like, you know what? That might be true, but if I think it made him more interesting as a character if there was a different reason. And again, I'm tiptoeing because I don't want to give away what those reasons were, but they did involve Alan Pinkerton. But that he wasn't just doing it out of the good of his heart, right? He was, but there were other reasons. And so anyway, I say that only to say, in my opinion, it actually would be more interesting or make characters more interesting if they're not just totally doing it we're just doing it because we're the good guys and this is what the good guys do,
Yeah, which makes it's more realistic too, because that's usually how it works. Is people often have ulterior motives, and I guess that sounds like it's always negative, but it's not always just to do the right thing. They're trying to make money too. It's a business.
And yeah, and again, the Pinkertons were about making money, and there are certainly lots of people who have argued over the years that they weren't just trying to do the right thing. But it's, again, I'm talking more from a writer's standpoint here, but it helps you create three-dimensional characters, right? If it's not just, well, we're always going to do what's right. We're always going to do, what needs to be done at the end of the day. So, but anyway, like I said, that's kind of an aside to the whole question. So,
well, if we go back to the series, we're on episode number 6, and we start to see a more complex relationship between the Pinkertons and law enforcement as the episode's crime revolves around the murder of another Pinkerton agent. And Kate and Will are surprised to find out that there's other Pinkerton agents working undercover in Kansas City without their knowledge. And as part of this episode, we find a brand new technique introduced called and identity parade is what they call it in the series. In the episode, Kate helps us out by calling it a term that we're more familiar with today, a police lineup. Now, of course, we're all familiar with police lineups now, but in this episode, it really seems to imply that the Pinkertons introduced this concept to law enforcement. Is there any truth to that?
I couldn't find any documentation of it. Now, that's not to say that they didn't, because the Pinkertons were definitely innovative when it came to investigative techniques. And one of the things that they did invent, or at least take credit for inventing, is a mugshot book where you can photograph. Of course, photography was a relatively new technology at that time. I think it was maybe invented in the U.S. in the 1830s or something like that, maybe 1840. So, but they'd started taking pictures of everybody they encountered, everybody they arrested. And by like 1875, I think it was the date that I had found, they had a very substantial mugshot book that people could look through. And some of the other techniques that I already talked about, like, shadowing people and certain interrogation techniques and stuff. So they were extremely innovative, and not even using female detectives, right? That was something that was unheard of. Like I said, Kate Warren was the first, at least in the US, maybe in the world, the first female detective. So they recognized that there was an ability to, that she could go places and do things that a male detective couldn't ever, especially in the 19th century. So they were willing to innovate. I wasn't able to find any reference one way or the other as to a police lineup. I did want to touch on one other thing that you mentioned there about they were surprised that there was another Pinkerton operative. Again, I would be very surprised that there were more than two in Kansas City, because there wouldn't be any reason. But it wouldn't have been unusual for the Pinkertons to have multiple operatives in a given city at the same time and not necessarily know that each other are there. There's some documentation of that in Richmond during the Civil War, again, when they were carrying out their espionage efforts. There was one case in particular where they talked about an operative walking into, I think he went into a bar, and the guy that was tending bar, he recognized him immediately as another Pinkerton. But they were both in Richmond on spying assignments, but didn't know each other were there until they, bumped into each other. So that wouldn't have been all that unusual. And you got to consider the time period as well. It's not like, you could text somebody and say, "Hey, where are you at?" Or look on your phone at their tracking on their GPS. So the Pinkertons, as I said earlier, moved about quite a bit. And it wouldn't have been at all unusual for, two agents to end up in the same city, same place at the same time, and not necessarily know that.
I'm kind of even surprised that they would recognize each other. Like, I mean, you think of it with the photos and the mug book and things like that, but also you're not going to make copies of that. And sometimes you just don't, you don't know, you might know names, but kind of like what you're talking about before, we were talking about, Captain Buckner, and who was he? You might hear the name somewhere, but you might not recognize the face. And so know what they actually look like. And so I'm kind of surprised that that they would be able to recognize other agents, even to know that they're even other agents, like to know their face.
Right. Well, and this was at a time when the Pinkerton agency was still growing. So they didn't have all that many, they're probably at that time, I would say their agents numbered in the dozens, and they were mostly all housed in Chicago, right? So they would have probably bumped into each other. But just, again, by 1870 or 1880, Pinkertons had thousands of agents. And they were more spread out. By then they had offices, in different big cities across the country. So to your point, yeah, it wouldn't have been, they might have stayed right next to each other and not known it. And also to your point, talking about looking for a criminal, unless you had some type of photographic memory that you're like, oh, I saw that picture of that mugshot of that person that was in the Chicago office 6 months ago, and now I just passed him on the street. That would be pretty incredible. But again, plausible, I guess.
Well, you might have already answered my next question, because in episode 7, it's titled The Case of the Dead Dog. And the storyline follows the Pinkertons trying to solve a case of someone killing a farmer's dog. It turns out to be railroad barons trying to force local farmers off the land. And according to the series, the Pinkerton agents are on the side of the local farmers against the railroad folks trying to make big money. It's kind of a little guy against the big corporations, where we see them falling on the side of the little guy against these corrupt organizations. Is it true to assume that the Pinkerton agents would fight for the little guy like we see in this episode? Or like you mentioned earlier, maybe it's just all about the money?
Yeah, it's all about the money. Absolutely not. They were, we talked before about the Pinkerton agency growing from, a 1 or 2 man business into today, a multinational corporation that's, I'm sure, worth, many hundreds of millions. They didn't do that by working for the little guy. And really, it's a different era. I sound probably a little bit like I'm attacking the Pinkertons. I don't necessarily mean it that way. But they knew where their bread was buttered, right? And they were all about making the money, and that's what they did. But when I say it was a different era, it was attitudes of the time were different. And there were, maybe not as different as we might like to think, I guess, but there was much more class separation in American society than there is today. And that's maybe what I'm trying to say. So there was, what would have then been termed the lower class of society. And there was a lot of times just a presumption that, well, they're all criminals. They're all, to use another term of the time, layabouts. So there would have been less of a thought at that time to kind of come to the rescue of or stand up for that lower class of people. That there was just much more stratification of society than there is today. But I guess more specifically, around this episode where they're talking about the railroad barons, that was the railroad companies, banks, and what they called then express companies, like a Wells Fargo or I forget the name of the other company. It was like United Express or United States Express or something like that shipped things that were valuable. Those groups right there, railroads, banks, express companies, made up probably 90% of the Pinkertons' business in the 1800s. And they were all, they were the business conglomerates at the time. So quite the contrary of working, against a railroad baron, Pinkertons were working for them. And that's where they made most of their money. Most of the stuff they investigated was train robberies, again, like postal robberies or shipping robberies, which would be the express companies, and bank robberies. So, yeah, I'm sure some writer sitting somewhere, scribbling, typing away on their word processor when they wrote that episode was like, oh, they should stand up for the, little guy. And we like that a lot today, but that's not even a remote reality for the Pinkertons of the 1800s.
I'm so glad we got a chance to finally chat on the show. Thank you so much for coming on and cover the Pinkertons. We're going to cut it here at episode 7 in the series. We've got a lot to cover on the TV show. But until next time, our listeners can pass the time with your fantastic book called In Freedom's Shadow that I've got a copy right here. It features one of the main characters in the show is the protagonist in your historical novel. So can you give our listeners a little preview of your book?
Sure. We touched on it a little bit, but it is about, it is based on the true story of John Scoble. It is about, as I said, his escape from slavery, his recruitment by the Pinkertons, specifically Allan Pinkerton, to become a spy for the Union Army. And that's probably, I haven't counted the pages, but that's probably about the first quarter or third of the book. And then the rest of the book dives into missions that he went undercover into the Confederacy to spy on the Confederates and help the Union cause. And so just to, since we're on the Based on True Story podcast, for everybody's knowledge, what I did with the book, with one notable exception that you'll find out about if you read to the very last sentence of the book. But I made a commitment to myself that I was going to use whatever facts were known about a person or an event, that I would use those in the book in the way that we knew them to be in real life. So I tried not to bend timelines or say, oh, this person was, over here, when in reality, he or she was actually over here. If I knew they were here, that's where they are in the book. So it is, again, to the extent that we knew the information, I tried to adhere to stricter rules than the writers of the Pinkertons. I tried to keep it, aligned with reality, as much as I say as much as possible. That's not to say that, well, I just decided to fabricate something, but it's more that we didn't know some of the details. And so the true story part that I've described about John Scoble was really kind of the skeleton of the story. And then I fleshed out the rest of the novel with putting more of the meat on the bones and filling in what happened in between there. And so that's why it ended up being a novel instead of a nonfiction book, because we just don't know all that much. And I felt I wanted to fill that story in and make it more complete.
Makes perfect sense. I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes, and we'll have you back on to continue talking about the Pinkertons. Thanks again so much for your time, Rob.
I appreciate it, Dan. I'm thrilled to be on. As you know, I've been a fan of the show for several years, so I was very excited to be invited.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Rob once again for taking the time to help us separate fact from fiction in the first 7 episodes of The Pinkertons. And we'll have Rob back on the podcast soon to continue our look at episodes number 8 to 14 of the TV show. But in the meantime, be sure to check out Rob's historical novel called In Freedom's Shadow. As Rob talked about, In Freedom's Shadow is a historical novel centered around a little-known person in history who we should all learn a little more about, John Scoble. Hop into the show notes right now to grab your copy, or as always, you can find a link to it on the show's home on the web at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/360. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, the Pinkertons really did investigate the first train robbery in the United States. Number 2, Allan Pinkerton started his detective agency in Kansas City, Missouri. Number 3, Kate Warren was the first female detective in the United States. Did you figure out which one is a lie? Got the envelope right here. Let's open that up. And the lie is number 2. Even though the show never really truly comes out to say the Pinkertons started in Kansas City, Missouri in those exact words, it highly suggests that is the case when the series starts in Kansas City and then Allan Pinkerton heads off to Chicago. But the true story of the Pinkertons' early days is that Allan Pinkerton founded his company in Chicago, Illinois, and then spread to other major cities like New York City. As Rob pointed out, they didn't even have an office in Kansas City during the timeline of the series, because back then, Kansas City wasn't nearly as much of a city as some of those other places. Thanks so much for listening to this episode, or watching if you're on the video version. Speaking of the video version, stick around for the credits at the end to see all the wonderful Based on a True Story producers who help make this show possible with their support. If you want to help support the next episode and get your name in the credits for that video, you can learn all about how to do that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/producers. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Rob and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.